The house felt different the moment Patricia heard the front door close for the last time. Not slammed in anger, but pulled shut, with a quiet finality that was somehow worse. And she stood in the hallway, still holding the coffee cup she'd been carrying when Richard had announced he was leaving. Announced it casually like he was mentioning a business trip. Except this trip had no return date because he wasn't coming back, was moving in with a woman from his office. Someone younger. Someone who made him feel alive again. Those were his exact words. Made him feel alive, as if Patricia had spent 32 years slowly killing him with her presence, and now at 57 years old she stood alone in the too quiet house and realized she had no idea who she was. Without him, had built her entire adult life around being Richard's wife. And now Richard was gone and she was just Patricia. Whoever that was, standing in an empty hallway at 3 in the afternoon on a Tuesday holding a coffee cup that had gone cold. She heard a sound from the front yard, a soft rhythmic scraping that didn't register at first. And when she finally moved to the window and looked out, she saw a young man she didn't recognize raking leaves in her yard, moving with careful, deliberate strokes. And she felt a flash of irritation because this was not the day for landscapers or solicitors or anyone who required her attention. This was the day her life had ended, and she needed everyone to leave her alone. But something made her keep watching. Something about the way he moved, the concentration on his face, the gentleness with which he gathered the leaves into piles. And she realized with a strange, distant clarity that this stranger in her yard was the first person she'd looked at in hours who wasn't Richard, wasn't the ghost of Richard, wasn't the echo of Richard's voice saying he didn't love her anymore. And she pressed her forehead against the cool glass and let herself cry for the first time since he'd left. Before I continue, hit subscribe and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. Patricia didn't remember hiring a lawn service, couldn't recall Richard mentioning anything about yard work. But then again, Richard hadn't mentioned a lot of things, like the affair he'd been having for 6 months, or the apartment he'd already rented, or the fact that he'd been slowly moving his belongings out piece by piece, so that when he finally announced he was leaving, there was almost nothing left of him to pack. And she realized, standing there, that she hadn't really been paying attention, had been sleepwalking through her own life, going through motions, organizing charity events and book club meetings and dinner parties, performing the role of successful wife so convincingly that she'd forgotten to notice her marriage was dying. Or maybe it had been dead for years, and she'd just been too busy maintaining appearances to check for a pulse. She walked away from the window, set the cold coffee down on the hall table next to the framed wedding photo she suddenly couldn't stand to look at, and climbed the stairs to her bedroom, where everything still smelled like Richard's cologne, where his side of the closet stood empty with just wire hangers dangling, like accusations. And she lay down on the bed, still wearing her shoes, and stared at the ceiling. Tried to remember the last time she and Richard had laughed together. Really laughed. Not polite chuckles at dinner parties, but genuine, shared joy. And she couldn't remember. Couldn't pull up a single recent memory of happiness. And that realization hurt more than the leaving, because it meant they'd been over long before today, meant she'd been living in a marriage that was already finished and hadn't known it. The doorbell rang an hour later, and Patricia ignored it. Ignored the second ring. But the third ring was accompanied by a knock, and a young male voice calling out, "Excuse me, ma'am. Sorry to bother you, but I wanted to let you know I finished the front yard and wanted to check if you needed the back done too." And Patricia sat up slowly, her head pounding from crying, and walked downstairs on unsteady legs and opened the door to find the young man from the yard standing there with his rake still in hand, and up close she could see he was probably in his early 20s, with dark hair that curled slightly at the edges, kind eyes that seemed older than his face. And he said, "I'm sorry. I should have knocked first. I didn't mean to startle you." And Patricia said, "I didn't hire you." And he looked confused and said, "Oh, I thought. I saw the leaves and the grass was getting long, and I live 2 streets over, and I do yard work sometimes for extra money, and I thought maybe you could use the help. And Patricia said you just decided to do my yard without asking. And he said, I know it sounds weird. I'm sorry. I should have asked. First, it's just you have that big maple tree, and it drops leaves like crazy this time of year. And I thought, and he stopped. Talking, seemed to realize how strange this all sounded. And he said, I'm sorry. I'll go. I don't want payment or anything. I just thought I was helping. And something about his genuine embarrassment, his obvious discomfort, his complete lack of ulterior motive made Patricia feel something crack open in her chest, and she said, no. Wait, how much would you charge? For the front and back? And he said, honestly, I wasn't. I was just doing it to do it. But if you want to pay me whatever you think is fair. And Patricia said, $50 for both, is that reasonable? And he said, that's more than reasonable. That's generous, and Patricia said, good, do the backyard too. And she turned and went back inside before he could see her start crying again. His name was Marcus, she learned later, Marcus Rivera, and he came back the next day to mow the lawn, and day after that to trim the hedges. And Patricia found herself watching him work from the upstairs window, found something soothing about his steady presence, his uncomplicated competence, the way he approached each task with focus and care. And on the fourth day, she made too much coffee and brought a cup out to him. And he was surprised, almost dropped his pruning shears. And he said, thank you. You didn't have to do that. And Patricia said, I made too much. And Marcus said, thank you anyway. And they stood there in the October sunshine, her in her expensive casual clothes that suddenly felt like a costume, him in his worn jeans and faded t-shirt that had paint stains across the front. And there was a long, awkward silence before Marcus said, I don't want to pry, but are you okay, you seem? He paused, searching for words. You seem like you're carrying something heavy. And Patricia felt tears spring to her eyes because no one had asked her that. Not her friends who called with carefully worded questions about Richard's absence. Not her daughter who lived across the country and had responded to the news of the separation with a breezy text saying she wasn't surprised. Not anyone, and this stranger in her yard was the first person to ask if she was okay. And she said my husband left. Marcus said I'm sorry, and Patricia said he left me for someone younger, which is such a cliché, I can hardly stand it. And Marcus said I don't think pain becomes less real just because it's common. And Patricia looked at him, really looked at him, and thought that was a remarkably wise thing for someone so young to say. The neighborhood noticed Marcus's presence. Of course they noticed. Neighbors in expensive suburban developments always noticed anything outside the expected routine, and within a week, Patricia's friend Diane called to ask about the young man who seemed to be at Patricia's house every day. And Patricia said, he's helping with the yard. And Diane said, every day, though. That seems excessive. And Patricia said, I have a large yard. And Diane said, I'm just concerned. You're vulnerable right now. You need to be careful. And Patricia said, careful of what? He's helping me with yard work. And Diane said, I'm just saying, young men can be opportunistic, especially with women in your situation. And Patricia felt something cold settle in her stomach, and she said, what situation is that, Diane? What situation am I in exactly? And Diane backtracked, said she didn't mean anything by it, just wanted Patricia to be safe. But after she hung up, Patricia stood in her kitchen and felt the full weight of how she would be perceived. Now divorced woman in her 50s, alone, vulnerable, prey, and the thought made her sick, made her angry, made her want to call Diane back and scream that she wasn't some foolish old woman who couldn't tell genuine kindness from manipulation. But she didn't call back because part of her, a small poisonous part, wondered if Diane was right, wondered if Marcus had some angle she wasn't seeing, wondered if her judgment was compromised by loneliness and grief. Marcus noticed the change in her immediately. The next day, when he arrived to work on the garden beds, she was distant, answered his friendly greeting with a curt nod, didn't offer coffee, stayed inside, and he worked for 2 hours and then knocked on her door. And when she answered, he said, "I'm finished for today, but I need to ask you something." And Patricia said, "What?" And Marcus said, "Did I do something wrong? Because you seem upset." And Patricia said, "No, you didn't do anything wrong." And Marcus said, "Okay, but I can tell something changed. And if I made you uncomfortable, or if you want me to stop coming, I understand." And Patricia said, "Why are you here, really?" And Marcus looked confused and said, "What do you mean?" And Patricia said, "Why are you spending so much time helping me? What do you want?" And Marcus was quiet for a long moment, and then he said, "My mom died 3 years ago, cancer, and she was around your age. And after she died, I kept thinking about all the things I should have done for her, all the ways I should have helped. And I can't do those things for her anymore, but I can do them for other people, and maybe that makes me feel less guilty. I don't know." And Patricia felt something in her chest break open, and she said, "I'm sorry. I shouldn't have questioned your motives." And Marcus said, "It's okay. I understand. You're going through something hard, and people probably aren't making it easier. But I promise I'm not here because I want anything from you. I'm here because helping you helps me." And Patricia nodded and said, "Thank you for being honest." And Marcus said, "Always," and he left. And Patricia closed the door and leaned against it and cried for the second time that week. The days developed a rhythm. Marcus would arrive mid-morning, would work for a few hours. Patricia would bring coffee or water. They would talk for a few minutes. Nothing deep, just surface pleasantries, weather, neighborhood news, his classes at community college where he was studying landscape, architecture, her vague mentions of her life before, and slowly, carefully, Patricia felt herself beginning to breathe again, beginning to exist as something other than Richard's abandoned wife. And one afternoon, Marcus asked if she wanted help organizing the garage, said he'd noticed it was full of boxes and tools and general chaos. And Patricia said, "You don't have to do that." And Marcus said, "I know, but I'm good at organizing, and you've been paying me to basically maintain an already perfect yard. This would actually be useful." And Patricia laughed, actually laughed for the first time in weeks, and she said, "You're right. The yard doesn't need daily attention." And Marcus grinned and said, "I know, but I like coming here." And Patricia said, "Why?" And Marcus said, "Because you're kind. Because you treat me like a person. Because talking to you is the best part of my day." And Patricia felt something shift, felt heat rise in her face, felt suddenly aware of how close they were standing. And she stepped back and said, "We can do the garage. That would be helpful." And Marcus nodded, and the moment passed, but something had changed. Some line had been drawn and acknowledged, even if neither of them knew what to do with it. Working in the garage meant proximity, meant brushing past each other in the narrow space between boxes, meant Marcus lifting heavy containers, while Patricia sorted through years of accumulated possessions. And she found herself acutely aware of him in a way that made her uncomfortable, aware of the way his shirt pulled across his shoulders when he lifted something, aware of the sound of his breathing, aware of how young he was, how vital, how completely inappropriate it was that she was noticing these things, and she forced herself to focus on the task, on deciding what to keep and what to donate, but her hands shook slightly when he came close, and she hoped he didn't notice, hoped he couldn't read the confusion in her face, because she didn't understand what she was feeling, didn't know if it was attraction or just desperate loneliness, or some broken part of her reaching for anyone who showed her kindness. They worked for 3 hours and made significant progress. Marcus created a system of labeled boxes and cleared floor space. And when they finished, Patricia said, "Thank you. This would have taken me weeks alone," and Marcus said, "Happy to help." And Patricia said, "I should pay you more. You're doing actual work now." And Marcus said, "You're already paying me fairly." Patricia said, "No, I'm paying you what I'd pay a college student doing yard work, not what I pay a professional." And Marcus said, "I'm not a professional. I'm just a guy who knows how to use a rake." And Patricia said, "You're more than that. She paused, searching for words. "You're someone who sees what needs doing and does it. Someone who shows up. Someone." And she stopped because she realized she was about to say something revealing. Something true. And Marcus was looking at her with those kind eyes. And he said, "Someone what?" And Patricia said, "Someone I'm grateful for." And Marcus said, "I'm grateful for you too." And they stood there, in the garage, with dust floating in the late afternoon light. And neither of them knew what to say next, so Patricia broke eye contact first and said, "I should go start dinner." And Marcus said, "Okay. I should get home anyway." And they parted awkwardly, and Patricia went inside and leaned against the closed door and wondered what was happening to her. Wondered if she was losing her mind. Wondered if grief had broken something fundamental in her judgment. Richard called that evening, the first time since he'd left, and his voice on the phone was carefully neutral, discussing logistics, the house, the finances, the division of assets, and Patricia listened and agreed to whatever he suggested because she didn't have the energy to fight. And when he asked if she was okay, she said, "Yes, I'm fine." And he said, "Good. I'm glad." And Patricia wanted to scream, wanted to tell him that no, she wasn't fine. She was 57 and alone, had no idea who she was anymore. Wanted to tell him that a 23-year-old had shown her more genuine care in 2 weeks than Richard had shown her in years. Wanted to tell him that she was terrified and angry and lost. But instead, she said, "I have to go," and hung up and sat in the dark living room and let herself feel the full weight of her aloneness. And at some point she started crying and couldn't stop, great gasping sobs that shook her whole body. And she didn't hear the gentle knock on her door, didn't hear Marcus call her name, didn't know he was there until he let himself in through the unlocked door and found her collapsed on the couch. And he said, "Patricia, what's wrong? What happened?" And she couldn't answer, could only cry while he sat next to her, careful not to touch, but close enough that she could feel his presence. And eventually, when the storm passed, she said, "I'm sorry. You shouldn't have to see this." And Marcus said, "Everyone needs to fall apart sometimes. It's okay." And Patricia said, "It's not okay. Nothing's okay." And Marcus said, "Maybe not right now, but it will be." And Patricia said, "How do you know?" And Marcus said, "Because you're stronger than you think. Because I see you trying every day. Because giving up would be easier, and you're still here." And Patricia looked at him with her swollen eyes and smeared makeup and said, "Thank you for not leaving." And Marcus said, "I'm not going anywhere." He stayed for 2 hours. Didn't say much. Just sat with her while she composed herself, made tea when she asked for it, found tissues, turned on a lamp when the room got too dark. And Patricia felt something in her chest that was warm and frightening. Felt gratitude, yes, but also something more, something she didn't want to name. And when Marcus finally said he should go, that his roommate would worry, Patricia walked him to the time door and said, "I don't know what I would have done tonight if you hadn't come." And Marcus said, "I came because I forgot my thermos in the garage. I wasn't checking on you, but I'm glad I was here." And Patricia said me, too. And they stood at the door, and the air between them felt charged, felt like the moment before something happens. And Marcus lifted his hand like he might touch her face, but stopped himself, let his hand drop, and said good night, Patricia. And Patricia said good night, Marcus, and he left, and she closed the door and pressed her back against it and thought about the way he'd almost touched her, thought about how badly she'd wanted him to, thought about how absolutely impossible any of this was. The next morning, Patricia woke up ashamed of her breakdown, ashamed of her tears, ashamed of the thoughts she'd had about Marcus. And she decided she needed distance, needed to end this arrangement before anyone got hurt. And when Marcus arrived for his usual morning work, she met him outside and said, I think we should stop. And Marcus said, stop what? And Patricia said this, you coming here every day. It's not necessary anymore. The yard is maintained. The garage is organized. I don't need. And she stopped because she'd been about to say she didn't need him, and that was a lie. She did need him, needed his presence, his kindness, his uncomplicated care, but needing him was dangerous, was inappropriate, was something she had to stop before it went too far. And Marcus said, okay, if that's what you want. And Patricia said it is. And Marcus said, okay. And he turned to leave, and Patricia felt panic rise in her throat, and she said, wait. And he turned back, and she said, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I'm confused. I don't know what's happening. And Marcus said, what do you think is happening? And Patricia said, I think I'm a lonely old woman who's developing feelings for someone completely inappropriate. And Marcus said, you're not old. And Patricia said, I'm 34 years older than you. And Marcus said, I can do math. And Patricia said, this isn't funny. And Marcus said, I'm not laughing. And Patricia said, what do you want from me, Marcus? What are we doing here? And Marcus said, I think we're becoming friends. And Patricia said, friends. And Marcus said, yes, friends. People who care about each other, who help each other, who show up. And Patricia said, is that all? And Marcus said, do you want it to be more? And Patricia felt her breath catch, because he'd said it out loud, had acknowledged the thing neither of them had been willing to name. And she said, I don't know what I want. I don't know anything anymore. And Marcus said, that's okay. You don't have to know. We can just be friends. I can keep coming over, keep helping with things, keep existing in your life. And if it's just friendship, then that's fine. And if it becomes something else someday, then we'll deal with that, if it happens. And Patricia said the age difference. And Marcus said is just a number. And Patricia said people will judge. And Marcus said let them. And Patricia said my husband just left me. And Marcus said I know. And Patricia said I'm not ready for anything. And Marcus said I know. And Patricia said, so why are you still standing here? And Marcus said, because I don't care about any of that. I care about you. And Patricia felt tears start again. She said, I can't promise you anything. And Marcus said, I'm not asking for promises. They found a new equilibrium after that conversation. Marcus still came over several times a week, but the pretense of yard work dropped away. Sometimes he'd help with household projects, fixing a leaky faucet, replacing air filters, organizing the shed. But more often they'd just sit on her back patio and talk, long meandering conversations, about everything and nothing. His dreams of becoming a landscape architect, her forgotten dreams of being a teacher before she'd married Richard, and become a professional wife instead. His complicated relationship with his father who'd left when Marcus was young. Her complicated relationship with her daughter who called her cold and slowly, carefully. Patricia began to remember who she was, or maybe discover who she could be. Someone with opinions, with interests, with a life that wasn't defined by someone else's presence or absence. Marcus brought her a book one day, a novel he'd loved. Said he thought she'd like it. And Patricia read it in 2 days and called him to discuss it. And they talked for an hour about characters and themes, what the ending meant. And Patricia realized she hadn't felt this. Intellectually engaged in years. Hadn't had a conversation with Richard in recent memory that went deeper than logistics and social planning. And she told Marcus this, and he said that's sad. And Patricia said it is, but I didn't realize it until now. Didn't realize how small my life had become. Diane saw them having coffee on Patricia's patio one afternoon and called later that evening, her voice careful, concerned, and she said, "Patricia, I'm worried about you. This young man is here all the time. People are starting to talk," and Patricia felt something harden in her chest, and she said, "Let them talk." And Diane said, "I'm just concerned about your reputation, about how this looks." And Patricia said, "How does it look, Diane? Please tell me exactly what people are saying." And Diane said, "They're saying you're having some kind of crisis, that you're being inappropriate with this boy." And Patricia said, "He's 23. He's not a boy." And Diane said, "He's young enough to be your son." And Patricia said, "But he's not my son. He's my friend." And Diane said, "Patricia, be realistic at 20%. 3-year-old man doesn't spend this much time with a woman your age unless he wants something." And Patricia said, "What do you think he wants? Money? Sex? Please enlighten me about my own situation." And Diane said, "I don't know, but I know it's not normal." And Patricia said, "Normal? Normal is being married for 32 years and not noticing your husband stopped loving you. Normal is defining yourself entirely by someone else's needs. Normal is being so empty that when you're left alone, you don't know who you are. So forgive me if I don't care about normal anymore." And Diane was quiet and then said, "I'm just trying to be a good friend." And Patricia said then, "Be a friend who supports me instead of judges me." And Diane said, "I'll try." And they hung up, and Patricia sat in her kitchen shaking with anger and something else, something that felt like power, like she'd just defended something precious, like she'd just drawn a line in her own life and said, "This far, no further. You don't get to make me small anymore." Marcus noticed the change in her, commented that she seemed different, more solid, somehow. And Patricia said, "I told my friend that I don't care what people think anymore." And Marcus said, "How did that feel?" And Patricia said, "Terrifying and liberating." And Marcus said, "Good." And Patricia said, "Is it good? Because now I've probably lost a friend." And Marcus said, "If your friendship was conditional on you staying small and acceptable, then maybe it too wasn't much of a friendship." And Patricia said, "When did you get so wise?" And Marcus said, "I'm not wise. I just know what it feels like to live according to other people's rules. My dad wanted me to be an engineer, told me landscape architecture was a hobby, not a career, told me I was wasting my life. And I spent years trying to please him until I realized he was never going to approve, never going to see me the way I needed to be seen. So I stopped trying." And Patricia said, "Do you regret it?" And Marcus said, "Never. Choosing myself was the best decision I ever made." And Patricia said, "I don't know if I know how to do that. I've spent my whole life choosing other people." And Marcus said, "So start now. Start. Today, what do you want, Patricia? Not what does Richard want. Not what do your friends want. What do you want? And Patricia said honestly. And Marcus said honestly. And Patricia said, I want to stop being afraid. And Marcus said, of what? And Patricia said, of the everything. Of being alone. Of being judged. Of what I feel when I look at you. And the last part slipped out before she could stop it. And Marcus went very still and said, what do you feel when you look at me? And Patricia said I shouldn't say. And Marcus said, say it anyway. And Patricia said, I feel less alone. I feel seen. I feel like maybe I'm not done yet. Like maybe there's still life left in me. And Marcus said, there's so much life left in you, Patricia. So much. And Patricia said, I'm 57 years old. And Marcus said, I don't to care. And Patricia said, you should care. I'm old enough to be your mother. And Marcus, but you're not my mother. You're Patricia. You're someone I admire. Someone I respect. Someone who makes me want to be better. And Patricia said, this is insane. And Marcus said, probably. And Patricia said, people will think terrible things. And Marcus said, let them. And Patricia said, I could get hurt. And Marcus said, I would never hurt you. And Patricia said, you can't promise that. And Marcus said, no, but I can promise. I'll try my best not to. And Patricia said, that's not enough. And Marcus said, then what is enough? Tell me what you need, and I'll do it. And Patricia said, I need time. I need space to figure out what I want. And Marcus said, okay, I can give you that. And he stood to leave, and Patricia said, but don't go far. And Marcus said, I won't. I'll be right here whenever you're ready. He didn't come by for a week. Gave her the space she'd asked for. And Patricia spent those 7 days in a fog of confusion and longing. Realized how much she'd come to depend on Marcus's presence, how the house felt emptier without him, how her days lacked structure without his visits. And she tried to be honest with herself about what she wanted, tried to separate genuine feeling from rebound desperation, tried to imagine what a relationship with Marcus would actually look like, the judgment, the comments, the assumptions people would make. And she tried to decide if she was strong enough to withstand all of that, if Marcus was worth that cost. And the answer kept coming back, yes, yes, he was worth it. But was she worth it to him? Was she worth the complications she'd bring to his young life? And on the 7th day, she called him and said, can you come over? And he said, I'll be there in 10 minutes. And when he arrived, she was waiting on the porch, and she said, I've been thinking. And Marcus said, me too. And Patricia said, I'm scared. And Marcus said, I know. And Patricia said, this could go so wrong. And Marcus said it could. And Patricia said, people will judge. And Marcus said, they will. And Patricia said, I might not be what you want. I'm damaged and old and complicated. And Marcus said, you're beautiful and strong and exactly what I want. And Patricia said, how can you be sure? And Marcus said, I can't, but I'm willing to find out. Are you? And Patricia looked at him, really looked at him, at this young man who'd appeared in her life at exactly the moment she'd needed someone, who'd shown her kindness without asking for anything in return, who'd sat with her through her darkest moments, who saw her not as Richard's wife or someone, mother, but as Patricia, just Patricia, whole and worthy and enough. And she said, yes, I'm willing to find out. And Marcus smiled and said, "Good." And Patricia said, "So what now?" And Marcus said, "Now, we take it slow. We figure it out as we go. We don't rush." And Patricia said, "I've never done this before. Been with someone so much younger." And Marcus said, "I've never done this before either. Been someone who matters this much. So we'll figure it out together." And Patricia felt something in her chest uncurl, some tight knot of fear loosening, and she said, "Okay," together. And Marcus took her hand, the first time he'd touched her, deliberately, and his hand was warm and solid and real, and they sat on her porch, holding hands like teenagers, and watching the afternoon fade into evening. The town had opinions. Of course the town had opinions. Whispers at the grocery store, pointed looks at the post office, Diane calling less frequently, other friends finding excuses not to meet for coffee. And Patricia felt the judgment like a physical weight, felt herself wanting to shrink, to hide, to apologize for wanting something that made other people uncomfortable. But Marcus was steady, was present, was unconcerned with what anyone thought, and his certainty gave her strength, made her lift her chin when she walked through town, made her hold his hand in public, despite the stares, made her remember that she, spent too many years living for other people's approval to start caring about it now. Richard heard about Marcus. Somehow word got back to him, and he called angry, demanding to know what she was doing, demanding to know if she'd lost her mind. And Patricia listened to him rant, and when he finally stopped, she said, "Richard, you left. You ended our marriage. You don't get to have opinions about what I do anymore." And Richard said, "I'm concerned about you, about your judgment." And Patricia laughed, actually laughed, and said, "You're concerned about my judgment. You who left your wife of 32 years for your secretary. You want to talk about judgment." And Richard said, "That's different." And Patricia said, "How is it different?" And Richard said, "Because," and he couldn't finish, couldn't articulate how his relationship with a younger woman was acceptable, but hers with a younger man was scandal. And Patricia said, "Goodbye, Richard," and hung up, and felt powerful, felt free, felt like she'd just cut the last rope that had been tying her to a life she no longer wanted. Marcus's father showed up at Patricia's house one afternoon, a stocky man in his 50s, with Marcus's eyes and a hard set to his jaw, and he said, "I want to talk to you about my son." And Patricia said, "Okay." And his father said, "I don't know what you're doing, but you need to stop. Marcus is young. He has his whole life ahead of him. He doesn't need to be tangled up with some older woman going through a midlife crisis." And Patricia felt anger flash hot in her chest, but kept her voice level and said, "Marcus is an adult. He makes his own decisions." And Marcus's father said, "You're taking advantage of him." And Patricia said, "I'm not taking advantage of anyone." And Marcus's father said, "Then what do you call this? You're old enough to be his mother." And Patricia said, "I'm aware of the age difference. We both are." And Marcus's father said, "So you're admitting this is inappropriate?" And Patricia said, "I'm not admitting anything except that I care about your son, and he cares about me." And Marcus's father said, "You should be ashamed." And Patricia said, "Why?" "Because I found someone who treats me with respect and kindness. Because I'm choosing happiness over respectability." And Marcus's father said, "You're being selfish." And Patricia said, "Maybe I am. Maybe after spending my whole life putting everyone else first, I'm entitled to be a little selfish." And Marcus's father said, "I won't stand for this." And Patricia said, "Then don't stand for it, but you don't get to make decisions for Marcus. He's not a child." And Marcus's father said, "He's my son." And Patricia said, "Exactly, he's your son, not your property." And Marcus's father left angry, and Patricia closed the door and leaned against it, shaking. And when Marcus came by that evening, she told him what happened, and he said, "I'm sorry, My father has strong opinions. And Patricia said, so do I. And Marcus said, I'll talk to him. And Patricia said, you don't have to defend me. And Marcus said, I want to. You matter to me. And Patricia said, even though this is hard, even though people judge. And Marcus said, especially because of that. They found rhythms, small domestic routines that felt revolutionary in their ordinariness. Marcus would come over for dinner twice a week. They'd cook together, something Patricia had never done with Richard, who'd seen cooking as beneath him. And Marcus was patient, teaching her techniques he'd learned from his mother. And they'd eat on the patio when weather allowed, talking until stars appeared. And sometimes Marcus would stay late, would fall asleep on her couch while they watched movies, and Patricia would cover him with a blanket and sit, watching him sleep, and feel her heart expand with something she was afraid to call love. That felt undeniably like it. And other times they'd spend afternoons at his apartment, small and cluttered with textbooks and drafting paper. And his roommate would eye Patricia with suspicion at first, but eventually warmed when he saw how Marcus lit up around her, how she made him laugh, how they fit together despite the obvious differences. And Patricia learned to ignore the stares, learned to hold her head high, learned to let Marcus hold her hand. In public, learned slowly that his presence in her life was worth any amount of judgment. And Marcus was patient with her fears, her doubts, her moments of panic when she'd convince herself this was all a mistake, and he'd talk her down gently, remind her that fear was just fear, not truth, remind her that what they had was real, was valuable, was worth protecting. 6 months after Marcus had first appeared, in her yard raking leaves, Patricia's daughter Amanda came to visit, flew in from Seattle, where she worked in tech, and she'd heard about Marcus, of course, had called Patricia several times demanding explanations, and Patricia had tried to explain, but words felt inadequate. So when Amanda arrived, Patricia simply introduced them, said, Amanda, this is Marcus. Marcus, this is my daughter. And Amanda was polite but cold, and after Marcus left, she said, Mom, what are you doing? And Patricia said, I'm living my life, and Amanda said, with someone my age. And Patricia said, he's actually a few years younger than you. And Amanda said, exactly, this is insane. And Patricia said, why is it insane? Because I'm happy, because someone cares about me. And Amanda said, because it's inappropriate, because people are talking, because you're embarrassing yourself. And Patricia felt something harden in her chest, and she said, embarrassing you, you mean? And Amanda said, yes, okay, yes, it's embarrassing. My mother dating someone who could be her grandson. And Patricia said, Joe, not my grandson. He's not your brother. He's a person who treats me with more respect and care than your father did in the last decade of our marriage. And Amanda said, so this is revenge. And Patricia said, no, this is me finding something real after years of sleepwalking through my life. And Amanda said, I don't understand. And Patricia said, I know you don't, but I need you to try. I need you to see that I'm not trying to be young again. I'm not having a crisis. She paused. I'm just being happy, maybe for the first time in my adult life. And Amanda was quiet for a long time and finally said, are you sure he's not using you? And Patricia said, I'm sure. And Amanda said, how? And Patricia said, because I know what being used feels like. I lived through 32 years of it, and this isn't that. And Amanda said, okay. And Patricia said, okay. And Amanda said, I don't have to like it. And Patricia said, no, but you have to respect it. And Amanda said, I'll try. The town's judgment eventually became background noise, something Patricia learned to tune out. And some people came around. Diane called one day and apologized, said she'd been wrong to judge, said she'd seen Patricia and Marcus at the farmer's market, and had seen the way he looked at her, the way he held her hand, the way he laughed at something said, and Diane said, I've never seen you look that happy. And Patricia said, I am happy. And Diane said, then I'm happy for you. And Patricia felt something loosen in her chest, because Diane's approval mattered, even though Patricia had convinced herself it didn't, and other friends followed slowly, tentatively, reaching out, admitting they'd been harsh, admitting Patricia deserved happiness however it came. And Patricia accepted their apologies with grace, but didn't forget how quickly they turned, how willing they'd been to judge, how little faith they'd had in her judgment. And she kept them at a distance now, kept Marcus closer, built her life around the people who'd shown up when things were hard, rather than the people who'd only been there when things were easy. Marcus graduated from community college with honors, got accepted to a 4-year program in landscape architecture with a full scholarship. And Patricia threw him a party, invited his friends and his roommate and his mother's sister who'd helped raise him. And she watched him surrounded by people who loved him and felt overwhelmed with gratitude that he'd chosen to include her in his life, that he'd seen something in her worth staying for. And later that night, after everyone had left, Marcus said thank you. And Patricia said, for what? And Marcus said, for this, for supporting me, for believing in me. And Patricia said, I'll always believe in you. And Marcus said, I love you. He said it simply, like it was the most natural thing in the world. And Patricia felt her breath catch because he'd said it before, but never quite like this. Never with this certainty. And she said, I love you too. And Marcus said, I know this isn't easy. I know people judge. I know you worry. And Patricia said, I do worry. Sometimes I worry you'll wake up and realize you want someone your own age, someone without my baggage. And Marcus said, Patricia, you're not baggage. You're the best thing that ever happened to me. And Patricia said, I'm afraid I can't give you everything you deserve. Children, a conventional life. And Marcus said, I don't want a conventional life. I want this life with you. And Patricia said, what if you change your mind? And Marcus said, what if you do? And Patricia said, I won't. And Marcus said, neither will I. And Patricia said, how can you be sure? And Marcus said, I can't. Nobody can be sure about the future, but I'm sure about right now, about how I feel about you, about wanting to wake up next to you, about wanting to build a life with you. And Patricia said, I want that too. And Marcus said, then that's enough. That's all we need. And he kissed her there in her kitchen, the kitchen, where she'd stood alone 6 months earlier, knowing who she was or what would come next. And she kissed him back and felt something in her chest expand, felt herself becoming someone new, someone brave, someone who chose happiness over fear. The house that had felt like a tomb after Richard left became a home again, filled with Marcus's drafting papers spread across the dining room table, his jacket hanging by the door, his coffee mug in the sink, small markers of shared life. And Patricia found herself thinking less about the past, less about Richard, less about all the years she'd wasted, and more about the future, about what she and Marcus might build together, about trips they'd take, projects they'd tackle, ordinary moments they'd share. And she realized that healing didn't mean forgetting, didn't mean the pain disappeared. It meant learning to carry it differently, meant making space for new joy alongside old grief, meant understanding that endings could lead to beginnings if you were brave enough to stay open. And she was learning to be brave, learning from Marcus, who'd never been anything but brave, who'd seen her at her worst and stayed, who'd held her hand through judgment and doubt, who'd chosen her every single day, despite all the reasons he could have walked away. Winter came, and Marcus spent more time at Patricia's house than his apartment. And one evening, while they were making dinner, Patricia said you should move in, and Marcus stopped chopping vegetables and said, "What?" And Patricia said, "You're here most of the time anyway. You should move in officially." And Marcus said, "Are you sure?" And Patricia said, "I'm sure. I want this to be our home." And Marcus said, "People will really talk then." And Patricia said, "Let them. I'm done living my life according to other people's opinions." And Marcus said, "Okay." And Patricia said, "Okay." And Marcus said, "I love you." And Patricia said, "I love you too." And they finished making dinner and ate it in the dining room that had hosted so many formal dinner parties during her marriage. Parties where she'd performed the role of perfect hostess. And now here she was, eating pasta with a 23-year-old man she loved, wearing sweatpants, drinking wine straight from the bottle, laughing at his terrible jokes. And she thought about how strange and beautiful life was, how the worst thing that had ever happened to her, Richard leaving, had led directly to the best thing, Marcus staying. And she thought about how you could never see it while you were in the middle of it, could never understand that sometimes you had to fall completely apart before you could build yourself into something new, something true, something that actually felt like yours. Marcus moved in on a cold February morning, brought his books and his drafting table and his worn leather jacket his mother had given him. And Patricia helped him unpack and create a workspace in the room that had been Richard's study. And as they worked, Patricia found herself telling Marcus about Richard, about their early days when she'd loved him, about how that love had slowly eroded into habit and resentment, about how she'd convinced herself that was just what marriage was. And Marcus listened and said, "I'm sorry you went through that." And Patricia said, "I'm not anymore, because it brought me here, to you." And Marcus said, "Do you think you would have noticed me if you were still married, if Richard hadn't left?" And Patricia said, "Honestly, probably not. I was so deeply asleep I couldn't see anything clearly." And Marcus said, "So, in a weird way, I should thank Richard." And Patricia laughed and said, "Absolutely not. He doesn't get credit for this." And Marcus said, "Fair enough." And they finished unpacking and stood in what was now their shared space. And Patricia felt a sense of rightness she'd never felt before. Felt like her life was finally actually hers, like she'd finally stepped into herself, into who she was meant to be. And it had taken 57 years, and a divorce, and a young man with kind eyes showing up to rake her leaves, but she'd made it. She was here. She was home. The story the town told about Patricia changed slowly, stopped being the scandal of the older woman and younger man, started being something else, the story of two people who'd found each other at the right time, despite the wrong circumstances. The story of choosing love over fear. The story of second chances. Patricia heard through Diane that people were softening, were starting to see. This wasn't exploitation or crisis, but genuine connection. And while Patricia was glad the judgment was easing, she also found she cared less than she would have a year ago. Found that Marcus's love had given her a kind of certainty that made other people's opinions feel less important, and Marcus's father, even, came by eventually, sat stiffly in their living room and said I was wrong about you, and Patricia said thank you for saying that, and Marcus's father said, see how happy he is. I haven't seen him this happy since his mother died. Patricia said, he makes me happy too. And Marcus's father said, take care of him. And Patricia said, I will. I promise. And Marcus's father left, and Marcus said, that was big for him. And Patricia said, I know. And Marcus said, thank you for being gracious. And Patricia, we all deserve the chance to change our minds. Spring arrived and brought with it a sense of renewal. And Patricia started thinking about the future in concrete terms, about whether she wanted to sell the house that held so many memories, whether she and Marcus should start fresh somewhere new. And when she brought it up, Marcus said, what do you want? And Patricia said, I don't know. Part of me wants to leave, to start completely over, and part of me wants to stay, to reclaim this space, to make new memories here. And Marcus said, we don't have to decide. Now we have time. And Patricia said, do we? You're so young. You have so much life ahead of you. And Marcus said, we have so much life ahead of us. And Patricia said, I'm afraid. And Marcus said, I know. And Patricia said, I'm afraid of dying and leaving you alone. I'm afraid of getting sick. I'm afraid of becoming a burden. And Marcus said, Patricia, everyone gets old. Everyone dies. That's not unique to you. And the time I have with you, however long it is worth it, is worth any future pain. And Patricia said, you can't know that. And Marcus said, yes, I can, because I already know what life is like without you, and I know what it's like with you, and with you is infinitely better. And Patricia felt tears start and said, how did you get so wise? And Marcus said, you taught me that love is choosing someone every day, that it's showing up, that it's being brave, even when you're scared. And Patricia said, I didn't teach you that. You knew that already. And Marcus said, then we taught each other. And Patricia said, yes, we did. And she looked at this young man who'd become her partner, her love, her home. And she thought about how impossible all of this had seemed a year ago, how she'd been convinced her life was over, how she'd stood in her empty hallway and felt like she was disappearing. And now here she was, more visible than she'd ever been, more herself than she'd ever been, more alive than she'd ever been. And she realized that sometimes the worst thing had to happen before the best thing could. Sometimes you had to lose everything before you could find what actually mattered. And what mattered was this, was choosing love, was choosing life, was choosing to be brave enough to let someone see you, really see you, and to see them back. And she took Marcus's hand and said, thank you. And Marcus said, for what? And Patricia said, for showing up, for staying, for choosing me. And Marcus said, always, I'll always choose you. And they sat together on the back patio where they'd had so many conversations, where they'd built this unlikely beautiful thing between them. And Patricia looked at the garden that was just beginning to wake up from winter, looked at the new growth, pushing through dead leaves, looked at evidence of life continuing, renewing, beginning again. And she thought, yes, that's what this is. This is beginning again. This is proof that it's never too late, that life can surprise you, that love can find you when you least expect it, and in the form you least expect. And she squeezed Marcus's hand, and he squeezed back, and they sat there in the late afternoon sun, two people who'd found each other against all odds, two people who'd chosen each other despite every reason not to, two people who'd learned that the bravest thing you can do is let yourself be happy. And Patricia smiled and felt something she hadn't felt in years, felt hope, felt possibility, felt like the story she'd thought was ending had actually just been beginning. And whatever came next, whatever challenges, or judgments, or difficulties, she knew they'd face them together, and that made all the difference. That made everything worthwhile. That made her believe, finally, that she deserved this, deserved happiness, deserved love, deserved Marcus, deserved all of it. And she leaned her head on his shoulder and watched the sun set over the garden and thought about all the ways life could break you open and all the ways, if you let it, it could put you back together into something even better than before.